The knock at my door didn't sound urgent, but the flashing lights at the end of my driveway certainly did. When I stepped outside, I saw a patrol car idling under the street lamp, red and blue reflections dancing across parked vehicles. My first thought was that something had happened nearby. My second thought came seconds later: this wasn't random. Someone had called. The officer approached calmly, notebook in hand. "We received a complaint," he said. "Someone reported individuals impersonating police officers on this street." For a moment, I genuinely thought he was joking. Earlier that evening, a few of my friends had stopped by. We had just finished a long shift and were still wearing our uniforms. Nothing dramatic. Standard department-issued gear, badges visible, patrol belts secured. We weren't conducting business. We were just grabbing food before heading home. Apparently, that was enough to trigger someone. Across the street, standing rigidly beside her mailbox, was the HOA's most vigilant resident. Arms crossed, expression sharp. She didn't try to hide the fact that she made the call. She believed my friends were pretending to be officers. The responding officer asked simple questions. Were my friends law enforcement? Yes. Were the uniforms official department-issued gear? Yes. Could identification be provided? Absolutely. Within minutes, it was obvious this was no impersonation case. My friends presented their credentials calmly. The responding officer verified everything through dispatch. Radio chatter confirmed badge numbers. The entire situation dissolved into something almost awkward. But it wasn't over. The neighbor insisted she had the right to report suspicious activity. She argued that seeing multiple people in uniform outside a house at night felt intimidating. The officer listened patiently, then explained that being uncomfortable wasn't the same as criminal activity. That's when I realized this wasn't about safety. It was about control. The complaint wasn't fueled by fear of impersonators. It was fueled by discomfort that we existed, that officers lived here, socialized here, and wore the same uniforms they worked in. As the patrol car prepared to leave, the officer pulled me aside briefly. "Everything checks out," he said. "But this isn't the first time we've responded here for something like this." That statement lingered. Across the street, the complainant stood watching, clearly frustrated that her report didn't produce the outcome she expected. No citations, no arrests, no reprimands, just confirmation. The flashing lights disappeared down the road, leaving the street quiet again. My friends shook their heads in disbelief, half amused, half irritated. What should have been a normal evening had turned into a spectacle. And yet, I had a feeling this was only the beginning. Because when someone files a complaint expecting trouble, and gets validation instead, they rarely walk away quietly. They escalate, and something told me the next move wouldn't be subtle. The next morning, I woke up to an email notification that immediately told me this wasn't over. It wasn't from the police department. It wasn't from dispatch. It was from the WA board. Subject line: formal concern regarding uniformed activity. I opened it slowly. The message claimed multiple residents felt unsettled by the presence of individuals in police uniforms gathering casually in a residential driveway. It referenced intimidation concerns and potential misuse of official appearance. The wording was careful, but the implication was clear: someone wanted to frame last night as inappropriate behavior. I read it twice. My friends hadn't conducted traffic stops. They hadn't activated lights. They hadn't displayed authority. They stood in my driveway talking and eating takeout after shift. That was it. But the email went further. It suggested that uniforms should not be worn for non-operational social purposes within the neighborhood and hinted at possible law review if concerns continued. That's when irritation turned into something sharper. I forwarded the email to one of my friends, Sergeant Alvarez, who had been there the night before. His response came quickly: "They're questioning official department gear." He wasn't amused. Within an hour, the situation escalated beyond neighborhood gossip. Alvarez contacted his supervisor to clarify whether officers could be restricted by private associations from wearing uniforms home after duty. The answer was immediate and firm. No law had authority over official police attire. By midday, the story had traveled through informal channels inside the department. Not as a scandal, more like confusion. Several officers who lived in different communities chimed in. Some had experienced minor complaints before, but none involving formal law documentation. That made this different. Meanwhile, neighbors began approaching me quietly. A few admitted they felt uncomfortable when officers gathered in uniform, but none believed it was illegal. Others were supportive, saying they appreciated knowing law enforcement lived nearby. The divide wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. Later that afternoon, a second patrol car rolled down the street, not responding to a complaint this time, but making routine rounds. The officer inside slowed briefly and waved. That simple gesture seemed to irritate the complainant across the street even more. By evening, another message appeared in the WA online forum. It didn't name anyone directly, but it questioned whether displays of authority belonged in residential spaces. Displays of authority. That phrase stuck with me. Wearing a uniform wasn't a display. It was part of the job, and sometimes part of the commute home. That night, I received a call from Officer Martin, the same officer who responded to the initial complaint. His tone was professional, but curious. "There's been follow-up," he said. "They're asking if uniforms can be considered disruptive." I almost laughed. He assured me the department stood by its officers and clarified that no laws were broken. But then he added something that made me pause. "If this continues, it won't stay a neighborhood issue." That wasn't a threat, it was a prediction. And judging by how quickly the narrative was shifting, I had a feeling we were heading straight toward a confrontation no one could ignore. 2 days later, the WA announced an urgent community discussion about safety concerns. The timing wasn't subtle. Everyone knew exactly what it was about. Flyers appeared on doors, emails filled inboxes, and the neighborhood chat exploded with speculation. Some residents thought it was unnecessary drama. Others felt relieved the issue would be discussed openly. I decided to attend. When I walked into the community hall that evening, the room was already crowded. Folding chairs stretched across the floor, and people whispered in small groups. The WA board sat at the front behind a long table, stacks of papers in front of them. The woman who filed the complaint sat proudly near the front row, posture stiff, eyes fixed forward. The meeting started with a calm but formal tone. The board president explained that several residents expressed discomfort about multiple individuals in police uniforms gathering in residential areas. He said the board wanted clarity on what was appropriate behavior within community standards. I could feel heads turning toward me. Before I could speak, another voice broke the silence. Officer Martin entered the room. He wasn't there to take sides, just to provide factual clarification after being invited by a resident. Seeing an actual officer in uniform instantly shifted the atmosphere. Conversations quieted. The board president welcomed him politely but looked slightly uneasy. Martin explained clearly that officers often wear uniforms while commuting or stopping briefly after shifts. He emphasized that being in uniform off-duty wasn't unusual or improper. Unless officers were impersonating authority they didn't have, which wasn't the case, there was no violation of law or policy. The board nodded, but the complainant wasn't satisfied. She stood and argued that uniforms could feel intimidating and that residents should have the right to control how their neighborhood looked. A few people murmured in agreement, but many stayed silent. Then something unexpected happened. A younger resident stood up and said she felt safer knowing officers lived nearby. Another neighbor added that uniforms didn't bother him, harassment over normal behavior did. The room's energy shifted. Instead of one complaint driving the conversation, multiple perspectives emerged. Residents began asking broader questions about law authority and where personal comfort ended and unreasonable enforcement began. The board tried to maintain control, but it was clear they hadn't anticipated this level of debate. Officer Martin answered questions patiently, repeating that no one had broken any law and that the original complaint was closed as unfounded. His calm tone diffused tension, but the facts hit hard. The board president finally announced there would be no action taken regarding uniforms. A quiet relief spread through the room. But as the meeting wrapped up, one board member mentioned reviewing community guidelines for future clarity. That line sounded harmless, but it felt like a warning that this wasn't truly over. Outside, neighbors gathered under streetlights discussing what they'd just witnessed. Some apologized for staying silent earlier. Others looked uncomfortable, realizing how quickly assumptions had escalated into official scrutiny. I walked home thinking the problem was resolved. Then my phone buzzed with a new message notification. Another complaint had been submitted. And this time, it wasn't just about uniforms. It was about authority itself. I opened the message 3 times just to make sure I was reading it correctly. The new complaint wasn't about uniforms anymore. It claimed that my friends and I were creating a perception of authority that made residents uncomfortable and that our presence in uniform could be interpreted as an attempt to influence neighborhood decisions. That wording felt deliberate, like someone was trying to reframe the story after losing the first argument. The complaint had already been forwarded to the WA board. By now, frustration had replaced confusion. We hadn't done anything except stand in a driveway after work, yet the situation kept evolving. Every time one claim was clarified, another appeared, slightly different, more abstract, harder to disprove. That evening, I invited a few neighbors over, not officers, just residents who had attended the meeting. We sat outside talking calmly about what had happened. Most agreed the issue was spiraling beyond reason. One woman admitted she felt pressured to stay quiet earlier because she didn't want conflict with the board. Another said he worried the HOA was starting to enforce feelings instead of actual rules. Halfway through the conversation, a patrol car slowly drove by during routine rounds. The timing felt almost symbolic. The officer waved casually and continued down the street, but within minutes my phone buzzed again, another forum post questioning whether police vehicles driving through the neighborhood were encouraged by certain residents. That's when I realized this wasn't accidental. Someone was trying to create a narrative. The next morning, Officer Martin called. His tone was more serious than before. "I've seen the new complaint," he said. "Just so you know, officers living in a community isn't misuse of authority. And we don't patrol areas based on resident friendships." He sounded patient, but tired, like this wasn't the first time he'd seen personal disputes dressed up as public concerns. Meanwhile, the WA board announced a special review session to discuss perceived authority issues. Even the wording made people laugh privately. Yet attendance for the upcoming meeting exploded. Residents who never showed up before were suddenly interested. Whispers spread quickly. Some neighbors suspected the board didn't know how to step back after publicly addressing the issue. Others thought the complainant was pushing harder because the previous meeting hadn't gone her way. By late afternoon, I noticed something else. People were watching differently, not suspicious, curious. They wanted to see what would happen next. That evening, one of my friends stopped by in plain clothes just to avoid attracting attention. We joked about how surreal the whole thing felt, but underneath the humor was disbelief. None of us expected normal off-duty behavior to turn into a community debate. Before leaving, he said something that stuck with me. "Sometimes people don't want solutions," he said. "They want control." That thought echoed in my mind as I looked across the quiet street. The uniforms weren't the problem anymore. The problem was the idea that someone couldn't control what they represented. And if the next meeting went the way I suspected, the issue wasn't going to stay inside walls much longer. Because when perception becomes policy, conflict is unavoidable. The special review meeting drew the largest crowd I had ever seen in the community hall. People arrived early, filling chairs and lining walls. Some came curious, others irritated, and a few clearly prepared to speak. The atmosphere felt less like a neighborhood discussion and more like a courtroom where everyone was waiting for the next argument. The board opened the session by reading the new complaint aloud. Phrases like perceived authority, community comfort, and visual intimidation echoed through the room. Hearing it spoken publicly made the situation sound even more absurd than it already felt. Several residents exchanged confused looks. Then the board president invited comments. The complainant stood first. She spoke confidently, saying that seeing multiple people in police uniforms made her feel as though the neighborhood was being monitored. She insisted it changed the atmosphere and argued that the WA should restrict uniforms outside official duty. Murmurs spread across the crowd. Before anyone else could respond, a resident from the back stood up and asked a simple question. "Are we really discussing banning people's work clothes?" Laughter broke out. Not mocking, but surprised. The tone of the room shifted instantly. One by one, residents stood. Some said they felt safer knowing officers lived nearby. Others explained that uniforms were no different than construction gear, hospital scrubs, or delivery uniforms, just part of someone's job. A retired teacher said she worried the HOA was crossing into personal freedoms. The board tried to redirect the conversation toward maintaining harmony, but momentum had already changed. Then Officer Martin entered again. This time, he wasn't invited by a resident. He was there because the department had been notified that the meeting involved policies touching on police appearance and conduct. His presence alone quieted the room. He addressed the board politely but clearly. Officers are often required to remain in uniform after shift for logistical reasons. Restricting or penalizing official attire could create legal concerns and was beyond law authority. The statement landed heavily. The complainant tried to argue that the issue wasn't legality but comfort. Martin listened patiently and replied, "Discomfort doesn't make lawful behavior improper." Silence followed. The board president called for a short recess. When they returned, the mood had changed completely. Instead of pushing restrictions, the board announced that no action would be taken against residents wearing official uniforms. They emphasized that the law would focus on enforceable community standards moving forward. Relief spread through the room. But something else happened too. Residents began asking broader questions about past decisions, unclear policies, and enforcement practices. The discussion stretched beyond uniforms into transparency itself. The board promised to review communication procedures and improve clarity. As the meeting ended, people stayed behind talking in small groups. For the first time, neighbors who rarely interacted were exchanging opinions openly. Outside under the streetlights, Officer Martin shook my hand. "You handled this well," he said quietly. "Most people would have escalated." I smiled, but something still felt unfinished. Because while the board stepped back publicly, I could see frustration on the complainant's face. She hadn't accepted the outcome. And deep down, I knew one thing. When someone loses control publicly, they don't always walk away quietly. Sometimes they look for another angle. And I had a feeling the next move was already coming. Right arrow continued to Chapter 6. For a few days after the meeting, the neighborhood felt calm again. People smiled more, conversations returned to normal, and the tension that had hung over the street seemed to fade. I almost believed the situation was finally over. The board had backed down, the rules were clarified, and most residents seemed satisfied. Then the envelope arrived. It was slid under my door early in the morning. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a printed notice claiming that several residents planned to file a formal safety petition, requesting stricter oversight of law enforcement activity within the community. I read it twice. The wording was strange, almost official, but something didn't feel right. It referenced law authority over visible police presence, and suggested residents could vote to limit gatherings involving uniforms. None of it matched anything discussed at the meeting. My first thought was that this couldn't be legitimate. I contacted the law office directly. Their response surprised me. They knew nothing about it. That's when concern replaced irritation. The document wasn't coming from the board, someone had created it independently. Later that day, rumors spread quickly. Some neighbors received the same notice. Others were confused and thought it was real policy. Conversations started again, uncertainty creeping back into the community. I called Officer Martin. He listened carefully, then asked me to send a photo of the document. Minutes later he called back, voice sharper than usual. "This looks unofficial," he said. "Be careful. If someone's distributing things that appear official but aren't, that becomes a bigger issue." That sentence made my stomach sink. By evening, several neighbors gathered outside my house to compare notices. The paper was identical in each case. Same language, same formatting, no signatures. People were frustrated, but more than that, they felt manipulated. One resident said, quietly, "Someone's trying to restart the fight." The realization hit everyone at once. This wasn't about safety anymore. It was about control of the narrative, keeping the conflict alive even after the community moved on. Just as we were discussing what to do, a patrol car rolled up slowly. Officer Martin stepped out, speaking calmly with residents. He explained that distributing misleading documents designed to appear official could create unnecessary panic and might violate local regulations depending on intent. He didn't accuse anyone, but his eyes scanned the street carefully. The atmosphere shifted again. Not tense, just serious. Later that night, The WA board sent a community-wide email clarifying that no such petition existed and advising residents to ignore unauthorized notices. The message ended with a line that stood out: "Please verify information before assuming it represents official action." That felt like a quiet acknowledgement that things had gone too far. As the street settled down, I stood on my porch thinking about how quickly everything escalated from one complaint. Uniforms weren't the issue anymore. It was trust. Who controlled information, who people believed, and how easily fear could spread. And then my phone buzzed with another message. Someone had posted security footage online showing who delivered the envelopes. The image was grainy, but recognizable. And suddenly, the story wasn't winding down. It was heading toward a confrontation no one would be able to ignore. By sunrise, the security footage was everywhere. Neighbors shared it quietly through group chats first, then openly once the WA board confirmed it was relevant to the situation. The video showed a figure moving from door to door late at night, sliding envelopes underneath entryways. The image was grainy, but the posture, the clothing, the unmistakable way the person walked, people recognized it immediately. It was the same resident who filed the original complaint. The street felt different that morning. Not angry, stunned. People who had defended her right to report concerns now felt conflicted. Filing a complaint was one thing. Distributing unofficial documents designed to look like policy was something else entirely. The WA board scheduled another emergency meeting. This time, attendance overflowed into the hallway. The energy in the room was heavy, almost uneasy. Nobody wanted drama, but everyone knew they were about to confront something uncomfortable. The board president spoke first, confirming that the notices were not authorized by the WA and that distributing misleading documents created confusion across the neighborhood. He emphasized that community trust had been damaged. Then the footage played. Silence filled the room. The complainant shifted in her chair but didn't deny it. When asked directly, she admitted she created the notices because she felt the board wasn't taking safety concerns seriously. She said she wanted residents to understand the risk. Her voice shook slightly. For a moment, there was sympathy in the room, until residents began speaking. One neighbor explained how the fake petition caused panic, making people believe new rules were being forced through. Another said it felt manipulative, as though someone was trying to control the community's emotions. A third reminded everyone that disagreement was fine, but pretending something was official crossed a line. Officer Martin sat quietly near the back, observing. He didn't interrupt, but his presence reminded everyone how quickly misinformation could escalate into real problems. The board asked him one question directly. Did any laws get broken? He answered carefully. While the situation might not automatically be criminal, distributing misleading documents designed to imitate official communication could create liability if it caused harm or harassment. His tone stayed neutral, but the message was clear. The complainant looked shocked. For the first time, she seemed to realize how far things had gone. After a long pause, she apologized, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for the room to soften slightly. The board accepted the apology but announced that future communications must come only through official channels. They also proposed clearer guidelines to prevent similar confusion again. As people filed out, the atmosphere felt exhausted rather than triumphant. No one celebrated. The situation had exposed something deeper: how quickly assumptions and fear could divide people who shared the same street. Outside, neighbors gathered quietly under streetlights. Some talked about moving on. Others reflected on how easily a simple misunderstanding became a community-wide conflict. I stood watching the crowd disperse, thinking about how this all started with one complaint about uniforms. Now the real issue had surfaced: trust. And rebuilding it wasn't going to happen overnight. Because even though the truth was out, one question lingered in everyone's mind. Could the neighborhood actually recover from this? The days after the meeting felt strangely quiet. No new emails, no complaints, no heated discussions online. The neighborhood seemed to pause, as if everyone needed time to process what had happened. People waved politely, but conversations were shorter, cautious. Trust had been shaken, and rebuilding it required more than one apology. Then the WA announced something unexpected. A community forum. Not an enforcement meeting, not a review session, just a conversation. The goal was simple: reset communication and rebuild cooperation. The wording felt different from anything they'd sent before. Less authoritative, more human. When the evening arrived, the turnout surprised everyone again. Residents filled the hall, but this time the tension was softer. Chairs were arranged in a circle instead of rows facing the board. The message was clear: this wasn't about authority anymore. It was about listening. The board president opened by acknowledging mistakes. Policies had been enforced inconsistently. Communication hadn't always been clear. The situation with the uniforms and fake petitions showed how quickly misunderstandings could spiral when trust broke down. That honesty changed the mood immediately. People began sharing experiences, not as accusations, but as lessons. A neighbor admitted she initially supported the complaints because she didn't understand how police uniforms worked outside duty. Another confessed he stayed quiet too long because he feared conflict. Then something unexpected happened. The complainant stood up again. This time she looked different, less defensive, more reflective. She admitted feeling uneasy seeing multiple uniforms in the neighborhood because she didn't understand what was happening. Fear turned into assumptions, and assumptions turned into actions she now regretted. The room listened quietly. Instead of arguing, several residents nodded. They didn't excuse what happened, but they understood how misunderstandings grow when people don't ask questions early. Officer Martin spoke briefly when invited. He explained how officers often remain in uniform after shifts and emphasized that communities work best when residents communicate directly rather than through assumptions. His tone was calm, almost encouraging. For the first time, the conversation felt constructive. The board then proposed new guidelines: clearer communication channels, transparent notices, and community Q&A sessions before policies changed. Residents suggested adding a feedback group so concerns could be addressed early without escalation. People actually applauded. Outside after the meeting, the atmosphere felt lighter than it had in weeks. Neighbors who barely spoke before now chatted comfortably. Someone joked about the famous uniform drama, and laughter followed, genuine, not tense. Walking home, I realized something important. The conflict wasn't ending because one side won. It was ending because everyone finally understood each other. Later that night, I noticed something small but meaningful. The complainant walked past my house and nodded politely. I nodded back. No words needed. The street felt calm again. But I knew there was still one final chapter left, not about meetings or complaints, but about what happened after everything settled. Because the real ending isn't the moment conflict stops. It's the moment people decide what comes next. And tomorrow, something simple was scheduled that would quietly prove whether this neighborhood had truly changed. The final chapter didn't begin with a complaint or a meeting. It started with something simple: a neighborhood barbecue announced on the community forum. No agenda, no rules discussion, just food, music, and a chance to reset. It sounded almost ordinary, but after everything that had happened, it felt symbolic. When I arrived, people were already setting up tables in the cul-de-sac. Kids ran between chairs. Music played softly. The atmosphere felt relaxed in a way I hadn't seen for months. The same neighbors who once argued over uniforms and authority were now passing plates and laughing together. Even the WA board members were there, not behind a table, just part of the crowd. I noticed Officer Martin stop by briefly during patrol. He parked for a moment, waved, and joked that he was only there for the food, not any complaints. Everyone laughed. The tension that once followed police presence had disappeared completely. Then I saw her, the neighbor who started it all. She stood near the drinks table, hesitant at first. For a moment, I considered walking the other direction, but she approached me instead. Her voice was quiet. "I'm sorry things got so out of hand," she said. I nodded. "We all learned something," I replied. And surprisingly, that felt true. The past weeks had exposed how quickly misunderstanding could grow when people assumed instead of asking. But they also showed how fast things improved when conversations replaced accusations. Throughout the evening, I watched neighbors interact differently. People introduced themselves to officers they previously only saw as authority figures. Conversations about rules turned into discussions about cooperation. The WA board talked openly about policy updates and encouraged residents to participate before decisions were made. The biggest change wasn't written in any guideline. It was visible in how people behaved. Later, as the sun started setting, Someone mentioned the original complaint, the one about friends in uniform. Instead of tension, it sparked light-hearted jokes. The situation that once divided the neighborhood had become a story people laughed about together. Standing there, I realized how close things had come to going the other way. One complaint could have turned into long-term resentment. Instead, it became a turning point. As darkness settled, neighbors began cleaning up. Chairs folded, lights dimmed, the streets slowly returned to quiet. I walked back toward my driveway and paused for a moment. The same place where patrol lights flashed weeks earlier now felt peaceful. No suspicion, no scrutiny, just normal life. My friends would probably stop by again after shift someday, still in uniform, still just people finishing work. And this time, no one would think twice about it. Because the community finally understood what had been true from the start. Uniforms didn't create division. Misunderstanding did.
And when people chose to talk instead of assume everything changed, the story ended without drama, no winners, no losers, just neighbors learning how to live together again. Sometimes the strongest resolution isn't loud or dramatic, sometimes it's quite like a street family at peace. Welcome to Karen Universe, where we dive into every wild, quirky, and intriguing story out there. If you enjoyed the, don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments.